Good morning, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Marketing for Zimperium. I'd love to welcome everybody to another of our webinars. We're really excited about this particular topic. We have a lot of customers that have been coming and asking us about this, and this being mobile fraud, and specifically the five hidden causes that create mobile fraud. But as we're going to get into it, even though this is not a product presentation at all, we're also going to tell you some ways to solve each one of these, because it doesn't really do us any good if we actually identify a problem and we have no way of actually potentially solving it. So we're going to dive into that. So a couple perfunctory comments. I love to say that because my mom's an English teacher. This is going to be about 30 minutes worth of content. We're going to do it in a really cool format, which I'll explain here in a quick second. At the end, we'll have Q&A. If there isn't any questions, then we'll give you your time back. We don't create questions. We're not into that side of the world. Please drop your questions into the Q&A capability. Don't use the chat part. We've had some issues with that on the Zoom side of the world. There will be an archive version of this up within a day or so, and we can make slides available to folks as well. So with that, we're going to dive in, and I mentioned that we're going to do this a little bit differently. We decided to have some fun because just doing webinars the normal way sometimes gets a little bit old. So we're talking about mobile fraud here, and with all of our customers, and Zimperium has literally dozens and dozens and dozens of financial services, retail, et cetera, customers. All of them, when it comes to this side of the world, there's usually two different groups of people that are involved in the whole process. There's the app developers, the folks that are developing the mobile apps, whether it's in-house or third party, whatever the case may be, but there's the development side of the world. Then there's also the fraud, or sometimes the InfoSec side of the world. But for the purposes of this conversation, what I've basically done is ask a couple of my esteemed colleagues, way more esteemed than I am, to actually join me on this and kind of to play the role of both of those. So the playing the role of the kind of the fraud side of the world, the business side of the world, is Nitin Besha, who is our Chief Security Officer, and more importantly for this conversation, Chief Strategy Officer. He actually runs our app protection business. So Nitin, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, JD, and good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here, and hopefully we'll have a really good conversation around what's happening right now in the world of fraud and what can we do about it. So JT, looking forward to it.
Perfect. Thank you, Nitin. And by the way, we can all feel sorry for Nitin because he's down by the beach right now. So he's sacrificing for the team. So we'll give him some credit. In a slightly colder place is Mikhail Kemperman, and Mikhail runs all of our technical pre-sales in Europe and other places, and he's also very accomplished from a technology stack development side of the world. So he's going to be playing the part of the app developers and kind of the app infosec sort of folks. So Mikhail, thanks for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Perfect. So as we start getting into this, let's start with the fundamental thing at the highest level, which is, if there isn't an actual business issue, if there's no reason to waste our time with the technology, no reason to waste our time with the security side of the world. So Nitin, can you just kind of give me a little bit of a feel for the state of online fraud, and kind of how does mobile fit in?
Absolutely, JT. Thank you for that question. So let me start by saying that online fraud is alive and healthy, right? So history tells us that whenever there's a downturn or there's a crisis, the fraud actually goes up. And the latest report that I saw, guys, just recently, it shows in 2020, fraud has gone up. Online fraud has gone up dramatically in 2020. And that kind of makes sense, right? This is a COVID impact. So people, instead of going to a bank, are trying to do more remotely, right? Which is through either a web app or a mobile app or something like that. So as people shift to that, obviously it becomes more attractive for someone who wants to commit the fraud. And so this has really spiked up, to be honest. Now, fraud, sort of hits all industries, to be honest. Wherever there is any online transaction, fraud is there. But it's specifically bad for financial industry. So when you think about banking and retail, that's where bulk of the losses are. And I'll talk about that in a minute, right? The other fact that I saw in a very recent report from last year, JT, was that 47% of the companies experienced a fraud over the last 24 months, right? That's a pretty high number. Almost half the companies globally have seen some incident, right? Now, sadly, only 56% of these incidents were investigated, right? So people either were not aware of it or didn't have visibility or didn't have the right tools or expertise to actually investigate or do a forensic examination, right? So a lot of these have gone really either undetected or basically, just gone on, right? So that's the bad part of it, right? Now, talking about the mobile industry, right? As you can see on your screen, nearly 3 out of the 4 transactions are via the mobile channel, right? So the fact there is that more than half the internet traffic today is via mobile, right? And it's, like I said, it's trended up during the COVID, where people are using their mobile devices a lot more than they ever did, right? So there is a lot more traffic there. And then the second fact is that mobile devices and mobile apps are very easy targets, right? This is where the hackers, you really have a full game plan in terms of how to really break in and get some of these transactions, right? So the mobile fraud is rising actually higher than the regular fraud. So the trends are very high. So as you can see, 72% of all fraudulent transactions were from the mobile channel. So hopefully it gives you an idea of what's happening as a trend, especially given the times we are in right now. This is a very relevant and important discussion. JT?
Yeah, no, that's I agree completely. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about, and we're not going to steal any of McKeel's thunder, but I do think it's critical at the highest level to, a little bit of a forest view before we play in the trees, is going off of what you're saying. And mobile apps are different than traditional web apps. And part of it is the fact that the mobile apps, once they're produced, they actually get put in a public app store, and now they're available to people. So McKeel's going to be talking about some of the different pieces with that. But, so Nitin, could you also just kind of, going off of this is fascinating. We've seen this trend even pre-COVID, where more and more and more transactions were being done on mobile, right? And with COVID, it just kind of set a new standard. But I think this is also pretty fascinating. So that the last one was the volume, but then the average amount is increasing pretty significantly for mobile fraud versus traditional fraud, which gives that much more reason to try and solve it. So, thoughts on this side of the equation?
Yeah. So first, let's talk about the impact, right? Let's talk about what really happens. So when you look at the financial impact of these fraudulent transactions, right? Consider the fact that the global B2C e-commerce market in 2019 was marked at $3.35 trillion, right? This is global, all of the e-commerce, right? So it's a huge number, right? And then when you look at the total losses globally, right, based on the fraudulent transactions, that was about $42 billion, right, in 2019. So when you look at $42 billion in a 3.35 trillion market, you feel like, hey, it's a small amount, maybe, can be considered as a cost of doing business. But if you ignore the fact that the market is really big and look at just that number of $42 billion, that's a huge number. All of this money is lost either by the banks, by the consumers, by the e-tailers, right? This money is basically gone. It's a huge loss. Now, not only is it a financial loss, but it's also, your reputation and your brand, which gets targeted, right? So if you're a bank, right, and you get into this fraudulent transactions, people sort of lose their confidence, right, on the bank. And that's not a good thing for any business. So there's a lot of repercussions of these transactions, both financial and non-financial. But looking at just the financials, right, if people use the right fraud protection systems or do certain things, and Mikhail will talk about, what can be done, some very simple things that can be done, right? the study shows that you can actually cut back about 60 to 70% of the fraud, right? So think about $42 billion losses, 60%, you're saving more than $20 billion, right? All of that goes towards your bottom line. Right? So it's a really significant thing to do, right? So the question is, how can we do what can we do, right? What are some of the simple things that we can do as precautionary things, as the right things, so that we can at least bring down this fraud, right? Even if we don't fully eliminate it, right? And then if you look at, on your screen, right, the average value of a fraudulent mobile transaction is $767, right? So probably a lot better to be careful right up front and take precautions than try to cure it once you get down that road. So net, there are a few things that are very straightforward, right? And our goal really today is to give you some best practices on what can be done, right?
Right. No, that's perfect. Thank you. And one of the things I think about here about this 767 number, and kind of related to another point you made, the average studies have shown that most companies spend at least 3x the value of the fraudulent number researching, following up on the ones that they do follow up on. So your 42 billion number in terms of what it actually costs is even higher than that, right? So and the fact is, everybody always jokes about the old Willie Sutton, the gangster back in the 30s who was famously credited when they said, "When are you going to stop robbing banks?" And he said, "When you stop putting money in them," right? So the fact is, the attackers are voracious. They're going to keep doing this. They're going to keep pivoting because there is all this money that's right in front of them. So, Mikhail, why don't we start stepping through what are some of these hidden ones? A lot of the fraud teams probably already know traditionally some of the techniques and stuff, but let's talk about in this new mobile world, what are the 5 hidden ways that the attackers dive in, starting with data at rest.
Yeah, so data at rest, right? So a mobile app, resides on a device and it processes data. And commonly we see that data at one point gets persisted in some way, shape, or form. This could be on the device. It could be even in the cloud, through an API, some remote locations. And we see a lot of, developers and organizations who build their own apps not taking proper precautions when persisting that data, right? And that kind of comes from 2 ways, right? One, engineers are under pressure to quickly deliver, so they kind of forget about security. Or 2, they're not aware of the security context in which they're storing data. To give you an example, we encounter apps that store data in buckets on the internet with no security on that whatsoever, right? And I think we got a whole bunch of content lined up in a separate webinar for that, but it is a very common thing that we see out there, where data is being stored on the cloud with no security whatsoever. Some engineers will say, "Oh, you know what, I'm just going to write it to the disk of the device and store it there," and then think that they're safe because the OS will keep it safe. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions. But what we see a lot of times happening is, data sitting on a disk inside an application which has keys, transaction information, authorization tokens, all kinds of valuables that you as an adversary would want to get your hands on, just readable in plain text, right? So not taking a good look at what is the security context and where I store my data is actually quite a big problem in mobile apps.
Yeah, and I think again, Mikhail, back to the point we were making a minute ago about the difference between mobile apps and traditional apps is where that data is stored, right? It's either like you were saying, potentially stored up, in the cloud or whatever the case may be. Is it secure? Is it not secure based on speed and getting things rolling and priorities? But then also the fact that the code, the app itself is physically sitting out in a public app store, being accessible to the bad guys. And that theme will continue rolling forward. So where the data is sitting and is it being stored locally or remotely securely is point one of a hidden place that fraud occurs, right?
Yeah.
How about Oh, you have a comment?
And on the back of that, right, once it's being stored there, the question that you really ask, what happens with the data, right? So somebody takes a backup of a device. What happens to the data that you stored on the disk? Is it going into that backup? And at that point, have you lost full control over that data? It's very common to have iCloud just take data off the device so that when you restore your device as a user, you get all your app data back. You're very happy. But that means that data is now outside of the control of whoever built that app, right? So kind of as a best practice, it's really recommended to, when you write stuff to your disk or when you store something somewhere, always do it encrypted, regardless of what the media is you're going to go put it down. Yeah.
Perfect. No, that makes a lot of sense. And so, and speaking of encryption, and by the way, you know, some of these might seem on surface kind of obvious, but I think like a lot of things, sometimes dealing with the basics and dealing with the fundamentals are critical. But one of the main things we're talking about here is, from our experience, these 5 are not theoretical. These 5 we see everyday problems where people from a development standpoint are getting into this, and for the various different reasons. So and you mentioned encryption, which again is kind of what triggered it for me. So yeah, encrypt your data. You know, that makes sense, and encrypt your code. That makes sense. And then there's the other encryption everybody always talks about, which is, what about data in motion? What are some of the risks that come as the data is going back and forth?
Yeah. So what we see very commonly is, engineers or app developers making mistakes in setting up encryption with a backend server. Not doing the right level of encrypting algorithms, using that, weak ciphers and all that kind of stuff. But more importantly, one of the most common mistakes we see is error handling when setting up a connection to a backend. So you're trying to verify that a backend is actually a genuine one. You do your SSL pinning, and then somewhere in that handshake, something goes wrong, and you still proceed, right? Because for the sake of the user experience, you're going to just accept that connection to that backend because you want to make sure that you deliver the function rather than compromising on the security, right? And ultimately, that makes you very vulnerable to interception attacks. So what happens is, you set up a connection, something goes down south, you don't do proper error handling, you accept a connection with actually an untrusted backend. Makes it for a very, very high risk of that data being decrypted on the traffic. Another thing that we commonly see happening is engineers that build in some SSL pinning, trying to verify the certificate or the identity of the server on the other end. But they leave their validation mechanisms in plain sight, or even the data they use to validate. So you take a backend server certificate, you create a hash, and then at runtime, you see if that hash lines up with what you're getting from the backend. Well, if you leave those hashes in plain sight in your app, an adversary could get those hashes, maybe even change them and repackage it in your app. It's very easy to get to. So again, it leaves you very vulnerable when you don't do proper protection of those hashes and those pinned SSL certificates.
So is it from an analogy standpoint, is it kind of like saying, hey, I've got my door locked, but I take the key to the door?
Yeah, exactly. Pretty much. Yeah. Flip the key under the door and everybody can look at it and go, okay, maybe I can use it as well, right?
Got it.
So yeah, again, making these mistakes are fairly common, right? To give you some anecdotal story, I go to a customer and they pretty confidently tell me, what's the pinning? We got all this stuff sorted, right? And we started the network doing some penetration on the communication between their app, and indeed they're doing SSL pinning. But then we get the binary of the app, we open it up, and we can actually see all the hashes sitting there in plain sight. So what we did next is we replaced those hashes with our own hashes, and we could intercept the traffic once again, right? So that was very vulnerable to a repackaged attack, and then we could really take pretty much any data out of the transmissions that we wanted to.
No, that makes sense. And again, consistently hitting that theme, that's not a theoretical, pen test exercise that can't be executed in the real world. It absolutely can be executed in the real world because anybody can get a hold of that binary.
Exactly.
Right? So there's that. All right, so data at rest, and a lot of these, when I kind of look at these, and Nitin, maybe love your take on this. When I look at these, a certain amount of these five ultimately come down to development techniques, checks and balances. What are we doing as a developer? And then we're going to get to some that actually have to do with kind of needing to protect yourself from the end consumer themselves. But as Nitin, do you think that's a fair way of looking at some of these, that some of them have to do with how do we make it easier to develop more securely and know what you're making mistakes on? Just what are your kind of thoughts from that level?
Absolutely, JT. So first thing, mobile apps are fairly different. Like you both said, they're different than your web apps and your regular applications, right? Because they are sitting on a hugely untrusted device, right? So when the developer is building a mobile app, they really gotta have that zero trust in their mind, right? So you don't trust the device, do not trust the environment, right? And always verify. So you gotta think that way. And the developers really do not have a lot of tools today to help them out on the mobile side, right? As you all know, mobile technology is very new, right? 10, 12 years back, mobile devices didn't even exist, right? So this has come through very quickly. And if you look at the number of apps, over 5 million apps in the various stores, right? So you have a lot of apps, a lot of developers trying to build apps very quickly without any help. So clearly, the mantra for building a good mobile app is to really build and test constantly, right? When you are developing it, once you've developed, about to launch, and even post-launching, right? So developers really need some help to not only scan the code, that's a given, but you also want to scan your app fully and then look at the environments, right? So a comprehensive technology is needed really to help the developer in as they progress, from build to build, to see what has changed, what the impact is on security and privacy of the data that the app handles, right? And make sure that everything is, protected, well protected, right? So, and we can talk later more about, how this can be done. But JD, this is a very important factor, and developers do need help.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think the other part that's implicit in what you're talking about is they need things that don't get in the way of their velocity as well, right? Yes. So it's something that's continuous and something that doesn't impact velocity, because that's what's driving part of this problem in the first place, right? So that's Michiel, right. Coming back, we talked about data at rest, right? That wherever the data happens to be. Then we talked about data in motion, the fact that some SSL pinning mistakes and putting the key on the front door and all the rest of that kind of fun stuff. What about live data?
Yeah, so live data being processed on a device. The key question I ask most engineering teams that I engage with is, do you have the faintest idea where your data is going on that device? What parts of the operating system is it processed through? And if it's sensitive, what's happening with it, right? The simple question is, are you outputting anything to a console? Okay. Putting something out onto a console.
By the way, Michiel, what in mobile speak, what is a console? Like, what does that actually mean?
The console is where all systems provide logging output on what's happening on the device. Now, usually you won't see it, but it's definitely there, and all the processes on your device can kind of interact with the console. They can send data to it, but they can also read the data from it. Okay, so through certain practices, you could actually monitor the console on a device to see what other processes are doing, okay? What they're providing you with. Now, if you were an app developer and you write a log statement, hey, I'm transacting on behalf of this person, sending money from this account to that account using this authentication token, just to make sure that when you're testing, it's easy to replay that same transaction. Now, if you do that in a real environment where this device is actually, in the hands of a real user, you're exposing very sensitive data to everything that runs on that device, right? So the data, where does it go, is a very complicated question, because a lot of times developers don't know, right? And the second question to ask is, how can you protect it, right? If you put data on a screen, just a realization, right? If you put data on a screen that is sensitive, it is somewhere in the memory of that device. If the operating system integrity is compromised, that data is exposed, full stop. So if you have transaction data, if you have keys, if you have whatever sensitive data in that device, and you're not sure about the integrity of the operating system, you're exposing that data. That has to be the assumption.
Got it. Got it. So, there's actually, there's two parts to what you were talking about. And it again comes back to developer. We have to have proper developer techniques and checks, as well as environment of the device itself, right? It literally comes back to the two parts you just talked about, if I'm following it.
Yeah.
Developers might be using things like logging to the console to do their own error checking and their own testing when they're developing the app. But if they don't reset that and not do that, then they can be exposing data. And then the other part is, if the device itself, because the user hasn't patched or updated or if that's compromised, then it's dangerous as well. And again, right now we're not talking about how do we solve it, but those are two very real things when it comes to live data.
For sure. And we've seen some of the malwares out there that actively try to compromise devices, obtain access onto a device that they shouldn't have, to actually get to that data because the value is there, and then harvest it in large chunks to then repurpose it and sell it on the dark net and do whatever malicious activity is intended with it, right? So we definitely see that happening out there. Just to give you a little anecdote, today I worked with a customer and we were looking at their data, and we saw that about 5 to 10% of their devices saw tampering events over the course of the last month, right? So, and this is not 1,000 devices, it's literally millions of devices. Tampering in the OS, but even into the app process itself, right? So this happens on a, I would not say on a regular basis, but it happens in the wild, and you need to be able to take precautions that when the environment that you're operating in is no longer safe, that you can actually respond to it.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So a little while ago, we were talking data in motion, and we were, joking around about, about the keys and taping it to the front door, putting it under the mat, making copies for all your friends, everything. Talk a little bit more about where do the secrets go?
Yeah. So secrets, right? So a lot of developers use API tokens, API keys, certificates, usernames and passwords, you name it. Okay. So the realization that I try to bring to every conversation that I have with an engineering team is, if you stick an API key, for instance, in your app, and you put that app on the store, every time that app is downloaded, a copy is made of that key. So congratulations if you have 10 million downloads on your app, you've also created 10 million copies of your key. Now, at that point, if you don't take proper precautions again, you're gonna run the risk of that key eventually being exposed and your APIs being compromised, or even worse, right, on your backends. So you need to be cautious of where these keys go and what you do with them, right? Ideally, you don't use them at all, right? And you use other forms of authentication that require fingerprints and tokens and device attestation to move away from using static keys, right? Where you have to, make sure that you really protect them tightly, right? And protecting them tightly means that you take obfuscation and encryption and all the standard practices that we know are good, but also that you protect them in the device, right? Remember, when the device runs the app, that is an environment that is susceptible to attacks. It can be compromised. So if that environment is compromised and your key is sitting there in the memory unencrypted, it's still up for grabs.
Great point. Great point. It amazes me to this day how many large apps, and not in terms of size of the app, but in terms of downloads and what you talked about, it amazes me what percentage of them don't even have basic obfuscation. It's just, there's some very low hanging fruit that really needs to be implemented. But again, in all fairness to developers, they're so used to having all the processing power behind a DMZ and behind the idea of needing to encrypt code is or obfuscate code. It's been there, but not to the same extent that is required, because you're actually putting it out into the world, right?
The paradigm shift from an engineering perspective is that traditional web applications, the code that is being built is run in an environment that is 100% controlled by the organization. And with apps, you build, you write your code, but it goes into an environment where you have zero control, right? Which is a full shift in paradigm from a security perspective in how you need to approach writing that code.
Well, and specifically to that point is when we start talking about this, right? And we've consistently been hitting on it, but this is there's the fact that even if you did everything right, and the first ones we're talking about, right? If you did absolutely everything right from a development standpoint, which we know is not totally possible, because people are moving so fast, you're always going to have some mistakes. You need to have checks and balances, and you need to have monitoring, right? But even if you did everything perfectly, and you have this car that has this absolutely brilliant, alarm system and everything, if you park in the wrong neighborhood, it's bad things can happen. So you're taking this car, this mobile app we just created, and we're putting it onto the devices that are handled by largely consumers who won't update. They might connect to bad Wi-Fi's. I mean, there's all these things, but then there also might be other things on the device itself, right? So talk about the ugly little neighborhood and environment that this car is now parked in.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of our customers that I talk to, they come back, well, we do root detection, right? That's kind of the basic thing. No, we do root detection, so we know the operating system is secure. Well, guess what? Sorry, it's not. Okay. It is a small indicator that will tell you something about the risk posture of the environment you're running on, but not a whole lot. Okay. What's the network that you're on, right? How easy is it to evade your root detection? I kid you not, 90% of the engineering teams I work with, what they do is they put a GitHub sourced root detection routine into their app and say, we're good. The routine is sitting there in plain sight for every adversary to see. If they want to go and compromise your app, they just read how you detect the root, circumvent it, and they go do what they want to do with a rooted device, right? And that even only starts the conversation around the integrity of the OS, rooting, what kind of patches are missing, what vulnerabilities do we know about the operating system. All these things drive risk that you need to be aware of in your app when you want to decide, do I even want to run here in the first place? And then when you run, the key question to ask is what and who else is here, right? We've seen this whole swath of malware out there that specifically targets apps and tries to kind of overlay or exfiltrate data or compromise apps, ultimately looking to generally harvest, large amounts of data, users, transactions from our customers to use that against them for all kinds of nefarious purposes.
No, that's perfect. And so, as we mentioned, this is mostly designed, this webinar is designed to give people visibility into ways that mobile fraud can occur that they might not be aware of. I mean, clearly one that people probably are aware of, and so wasn't part of this list on purpose, is mobile phishing, right? I mean, because with more and more people doing everything on mobile devices, we saw a 6x increase in mobile phishing attacks because of COVID, right? So, but that wasn't hidden. That's actually fairly well known and is something we need to deal with. So we ran through these 5. And as I said, this was really designed to provide visibility into what are the things I need to think about. And this whole thing is not designed to be a product presentation, but as I also said, we're going to just have one slide, and Nitin, I'll ask you to cover up on it, is, okay, so now we just ran through the 5. What do we do? How can I protect myself? And this just happens to be the Zimperium approach. But even if you choose to go someplace else, you need to cover these areas, right? So Nitin, can you just kind of run through some of the self-protection mechanisms, and then we'll stop for Q&A.
Sounds good, sure. So, as I brought up earlier, think about the zero trust, right? Where you really should not trust anything, the device, the network, any environment, right? Any interactions. So you really have to, as someone building a new app, you should think about that, right? Now, having said that, right, you really want to build your application secure. That means when you are a developer, right, you should really scan your app, your code continuously, right? So you need some help from technology. There's a product called Zscan that Zimperium has, which actually helps you that. It becomes part of your development environment, and it continuously scans whatever you check in, right? And it'll provide you a report to see what has changed and what the impact is. Now, this is the key mechanism to figure out if your data and your keys, as Mikhail mentioned, is protected or not, right? If you have leaky apps or if you have insecure apps, it's gonna help you at least give you the visibility so you can make some changes, right? Now, obviously, it's not just code related. As Mikhail mentioned, this is also configuration related. It's the environment it runs in. Gotta make sure you run it continuously to make sure that nothing is being leaked, right? Then the second part is to really harden your app. So shielding of the application. So obviously the low-hanging fruit is the obfuscation. You want to make it very difficult for someone trying to reverse engineer, right? To make sure that if somebody's trying to figure out how the logic works or look inside, that they're not able to do that. Integrity checking, very important to see if nobody has, tempered the code or figure out if something has happened so you can take some appropriate actions, right? So Z-Shield, which is hardening technology from Zimperium, can actually help you protect your application that way. And then finally, once you launch your app, you are in the wild, right? As Mikhail said, you have 10 million copies running on 10 million devices, right? How do you even have visibility as to what's happening with your application? ZDefend is an SDK-based machine learning engine that sits within your app and basically does detections for you and reports it back into a console to see what's happening. This will obviously help you determine if something is wrong and take some actions, but also gives you all the knowledge and visibility so that you can appropriately change your application for the next release, right? So these three combined take you end to end from the time you start developing your applications to launch your applications and to the runtime, right? This is something, if you tackle this, you are actually reducing your risk heavily, right? You're going from that 42 billion down to maybe, few, right? Or whatever the risk your app has, it's going to bring you down. So that's kind of like in a nutshell, if you think about it, you want to, make sure you have visibility, make sure you find the issues very early, and make sure you harden your app so that nobody can just walk in and look at your logic and make changes to it, right? So JD, I think that's kind of my recommendation or advice would be to someone who is thinking about reducing their fraud or building more secure applications.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And Nitin and I were having a conversation with some of the lead analysts at Gartner about this exact same topic. And they said that the majority of the customers that are coming in that are asking the question, the way that they put it is, first, how can I have continuous mobile app testing, right? How can I continuously build this process in the continuous mast going along this? And then a lot of them just kind of put the latter two together, and they basically say, and how can I protect it? And largely what a lot of people will say, and it's related to, Mikhail, what you had on your slide, a lot of them will say, how do I protect my app from malware? That's kind of a catchphrase. There's a whole bunch of other things that go into it, but it's, again, how do I know if BankBot is on here? How do I know if BlackRock is on here? Et cetera, et cetera. So we're gonna stop for questions. We're about 10 minutes over where we were shooting for, but this has been outstanding. So if anybody has any questions, throw them into the Q&A. In the meantime, here's a quick snapshot of our two esteemed speakers, including their contact information, if anybody is interested in that. And I am not seeing any questions. So with that, Mikhail, Nitin, thank you so much for your thoughts and your contributions and all this. And seriously, folks, we're here to help. Even if you just sort of like, hey, I just need more information on this. Shoot either of these gentlemen an email or shoot me an email at jt.keating@zimperium.com. And with that, I would just like to welcome or wish everybody a great day. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.